Today we're going to be looking into our App Center and a few of the more important apps that you can find there, such as Hybrid Backup Sync. Please remember to load us up with questions as we go along. We'll try and pick them up during, and if we don't, then we'll definitely answer them afterwards. And be nice and kind to Craig, because he's newly off paternity leave, so I'm sure he's nice and refreshed and ready to go. So I'll hand over to Craig. Thanks, guys.
Cheers, Tom. Okay, hi everyone. So today, as Tom said, we're going to go through a few of the different applications, a little bit of an overview of the App Center. Just to quickly summarize of the last webinars that we did. So we've done 2 so far. The previous webinar was about managing your storage. We covered things like snapshots, SSD caching, and QTier, with a bit of the iSCSI covered in that as well. And the first session back on June 11th was setting up your QNAP NAS for the first time. Just going through the setup wizard, creating the storage effectively as the launching off point for the second webinar. So today we're just going to go through lots of the different features with some of the more generic apps, but mainly we're focusing on Hybrid Backup Sync 3, a QVPN application, and also we'll cover QCenter in quite a bit of detail. QCenter is probably the most interesting application that we've got. If you have lots of QNAPs, more than one QNAP, it's a really useful tool for you to go through and manage all the different features within your QNAP. And if you've got a portfolio of quite a few of them, it really makes life very easy. So what we'll do now is we'll jump straight into the setups, the configs, so there'll be no more PowerPoint. It will all be live demo from now on. So hopefully everything works as it did this morning. All right, so the first thing we're going to go through here is we're going to go to our App Center. So one thing I will point out about our App Center is everything in it is free to download. So there's no authentication or anything like that. Everything in here is downloadable for free. There are a few apps in here that may need a subscription after you've downloaded it. For example, we do have some antivirus applications like McAfee, for example. McAfee will want a bit of money from you to continue subscriptions, but you do get a free trial with it. But everything else is free. Usually you'll get at least a couple of licenses, 1 or 2, depending on the application, to try some of the features. For example, our surveillance software, you get 8 free camera licenses. If you want to try a hybrid mount, you get a license free with that. If you want to go really advanced within the features, some of them may have additional licenses to add on later. But as you go through, there's a lot of different categories. There's over 100 different applications in here. So when you're in the all apps, everything's just alphabetical. You can sort it by categories down the left. And usually there are some interesting options to find in the beta lab section as well. We're not a completely closed system, so if you do have an application from a third party that perhaps doesn't want to submit it into our App Center, they perhaps don't want to abide by our guidelines to get an application accepted into the App Center, there is an Install Manually button at the top that you can click. So in this Install Manually, you can browse to a file of our Q packages, so somebody else that has made an application for the QNAP would make something called a Q package. It's a bit like a zip file, but it just does it's a ready to install file that can install directly into the App Center. You will get a few warnings that let you know that you're really sure that you want to install this. This isn't necessarily a trusted application, but if you trust the partner you got the application from, by all means, you can install it manually as well. So there's no switch to enable this. You just click the little plus button at the top corner there. So with some of the applications within here, you can choose where they are installed, for example. So some different apps that you may have, you can choose which volume they're running on. Perhaps you've got a system volume on your QNAP, or an app or an accelerated volume with a cache. So on some of them, you can go in and change it to a different volume. So if you click the Migrate To button, you can migrate it from one storage pool to a different one if you want to. So you could move it from the data vol 1, you could put it on a different volume if you so wish. So some people like doing this to organize the apps, where apps that need the performance can be on a more accelerated volume. Apps that don't need it can be on a less accelerated volume with, say, an SSD cache like we covered in the last session. So that's a little known feature that not everybody knows about. And if you ever did have a problem with an app, you can always come into the App Center. You can go here and you can stop the application, and then you can also start it once the application has stopped. So if you were to have an issue where sometimes maybe you had to reboot the NAS to make that application work again, you can do it this way. It's much quicker. You don't have to take down the whole NAS to get one app working again. So sometimes stopping it and starting it can solve a problem if something went wrong in the application. Okay, so not everything inside here is made by QNAP. So some stuff is from third-party developers, but all the ones generally made by QNAP are in the QTS Essentials tab here on the left. Within QTS Essentials, you get lots of different options that we've got, lots of recommended apps that we would ask you to install. But by default, not all of them are installed. They will use up resources on your NAS like RAM if they were to all be installed by default. So we don't install them, but if you want them, you can add them. It's always just a single click install to add them. Literally just click the install button, click OK, and then it's going to install that application for you, and it will also add the icon for that application directly to the main home screen. So it will add it to this main screen. And there's 3 pages that you can do here. I've got everything on the one page, but you can scroll through different pages. You see the little dots at the bottom there that will allow you to cycle through the different ones. So the first application I'm going to go through today is Hybrid Backup Sync 3. So this will be more like a high-level overview, because we did do a webinar on Hybrid Backup Sync 3 back on the 19th of March. If anybody does want to watch that entire session dedicated to just this application, it is on our YouTube channel, so you can go back and see that. And rather than me just explaining what the different options are, I do demos of the different options within that webinar as well. So anybody can go back and see that one. So here in the overview pane, you see general overview of everything that you've got. So it tells you about the different storage spaces that you have on the QNAP here. It gives you the different breakdowns, whether they're online, offline, if there's an error with your backup jobs down here at the bottom. So I haven't had an error in quite a few months, but it still shows the last error that's there. I can clear them if I want, but I thought, let's show everything so you can see what it looks like rather than a blank screen that says nothing to display. So it just shows you the different options. And you also get one little view here of the job status that shows you what's the big picture of everything that's happened. If you want something more detailed, you can always jump straight into a section. So here, if you jump straight into the jobs, you can see the different jobs you've got, whether they were a success. If you were to click into the backup job, so if I was to go look at this report, you've got different logs at the top, but you can scroll down and see whether there was data changed. So as you scroll through, you can see that there was some files updated there. It gives you the processing speed. The processing speed on this one's quite low because this NAS is not at my location. It's a remote location, and I only have a 14 meg upload on my internet. So that's why that speed is quite low. But if you were to do a backup change or something to a local NAS, it would go much, much faster. So this is a really easy way to see all the different jobs. So these are the jobs that are being sent from this NAS going out. And if you did have any jobs on another NAS that were coming back in, they would be in the incoming jobs section here. So here's a one-way sync that I've got from my other NAS. So I've currently got it stopped. It's just there for a demo. But here you get to see the jobs that are actually inbound to you from another location. So here within the services section, you see the different types of backup services that we've got on the QNAP. So HBS3 is the primary location that you would use to send data in or out of the NAS, usually on a schedule. It's the easiest place to set anything up, and it's quite compatible with a lot of different services, even with some competing NAS that are out there. Most of them would all have generally at least an rsync server option on them. So there's always a method to either get your data from a different NAS into a QNAP or from a QNAP into a different NAS. So it doesn't really matter whether it's everything's QNAPs everywhere. It doesn't always have to be QNAP to QNAP. Things do work a lot smoother when it's QNAP to QNAP, obviously, and we have a few more options and features that you can do with the backups if it's 2 QNAP NAS that are set up. So at the top here, the first thing I'll talk about is the Apple Time Machine backup feature. So we do have Apple Time Machine support. So anybody that's on a Mac and wants to use us as a Time Machine backup destination, you can use that. So here on my own computer here, I've got a backup that's actually happening right now. So this backup is going to this specific NAS that I'm looking at. So we can see here it's going to my TS-877. And it's just doing a backup. It's going to copy all the data in. It's going to make sure that all the information that's on my laptop is protected up there. And we do also support multi-user access as well. So it's not just for a single user on the network. You could have 50 Mac laptops on the network all backing up if you wanted to at the same time. Each of them would get their own allocated space. So each other Mac would not see the data from any of the other Mac users that are on the network. And it's very easy to set up. The only requirement really is that you have to have AFP enabled in the network services. If you don't have AFP enabled, don't worry. When you turn on this Time Machine backup feature, it will turn on AFP for you and it will tell you that it's doing that. Hopefully, maybe in the next Mac OS update, that might not be required. seems Apple is dropping the AFP requirement these days. But for now, when you enable this feature on the QNAP, it does require AFP to be enabled on the NAS. But don't worry if you didn't enable AFP when you did the initial setup wizard. You can enable it after the fact. It's no problem to do that. So here we've got the rsync server option, which you can enable. I've got it disabled on this one, and you've also got the RTRR server. So rsync and RTRR are very similar to each other. Rsync is sort of a Linux standard. Every Linux OS would be compatible with rsync server, whether that Linux OS is on a NAS, on a computer, it really doesn't matter. Most things would have rsync that are running Linux in the open source area. So you do have rsync as an option. I prefer RTRR. I find that the logging is a bit better. You get a few more options. You can also do things like backup versioning, so create multiple versions of your backup files within it. So the typical setup that you would do, if you've got two QNAPs especially, is you would decide that one is the RTRR server and one would be the client. So whichever one is going to be receiving the data is the one you would normally turn the RTRR server option on, and then you would create a sync job on the NAS with the data that's going to send it to that rsync server. So here we've also got an option for TCP BBR. That came out in one of the latest updates with HBS3. It's just a very, very efficient congestion control protocol that's enabled on the TCP stream. So effectively it lengthens timeouts and it's going to make your connection to slower bandwidth destinations be much more efficient. So rather than failing a file and having to resend it, which in the long run effectively makes your backup take longer to get there, TCP BBR gives that file a chance to get there, so it doesn't just abandon it and try to resend it multiple times. It will give it a long timeout to make sure that the data that has been sent already isn't wasted and it will get there eventually. You do also have lots of rate limit settings, so if there was a situation where you're using the NAS to send data out on the same internet connection that you have users trying to use the internet on, rather than have the NAS take all the bandwidth and make the internet slow for everybody, you can set some rate limits here as well. So you can limit the upload or download speed for anything that's coming in. And you can also allow it to be more secure, so you can allow all connections or only approved connections. So you can add specific IP addresses that are allowed to use this NAS as a backup target. So that's very easy to do. Most of the QNAPs, especially all the tower desktop chassis units, would have a button on the front, which is usually situated right next to the USB port that's on the front of the NAS. So the front USB port is usually a USB 3, and it will allow you to configure that button to do a task. So by default, pushing the button wouldn't do anything. If you were to come into the USB One Touch Copy option here, you can select the One Touch Copy and you can go into the settings for that button. So by default, the settings are, it will back up to the NAS. So if you plugged a USB device or a hard drive, or let's say a digital camera, for example, into that USB port on the front of the NAS, and you had it set up with backup to NAS, it would allow you to empty all the contents on that drive or device that you've connected to the USB port into the NAS, and you can choose the backup actions. So you've got add directory, which is effectively make a new directory for the backup job, just copy the data, or you can synchronize the data. So synchronize would be usually more useful, especially if you're using it to update the data more than once. You would use synchronize, because each week if you do this, it's only going to send the data that's new, not the whole backup job each time. So depending on which option that you pick, you then have to pick a paired folder. So the first paired folder would be one that's, say, on the USB hard drive itself, and then you can pick the paired folder of where it's going to go inside. So I could say drop it into the download folder, and I want it to come from, so you see that the arrow is going to the left. So if I add a paired folder, that would be something on the front USB port, and click OK. So now I have a pair where everything from the front USB port will go to the download folder if I push the button when I have a USB device connected. Now when that backup job is complete, or that synchronize is complete, you can have it manually unmount the USB drive or automatically do it when the backup job is finished, so that somebody can just pull that USB drive out once the unit has beeped that it's completed the backup job. So this is a really useful feature if anybody wants to have a hands-free, if you like. They don't want to get a computer involved on backing up data. We have a lot of photographers that like using it because it allows them to empty the SD card inside their camera pretty quickly, get a backup of it, without using memory card readers or removing the memory card from their camera. They can just plug a USB cable to the camera, offload it, and then they can carry on. And I see we have a question already from Christian. It says, I'm using Backup Station for a few years now. Does it make sense to change to HBS3? And if yes, why? Great question, Christian. So yes, if you install HBS3, it will overwrite and replace Backup Station. Effectively, it is Backup Station with some extra options. So Backup Station is fine. It has a lot of the options that you're seeing here on screen. It's maybe a little harder to set up if you're not familiar with it. So some of the options within there were a little tricky to understand which order you would do things. Now, when you create a job, it gives you a lot more options in it. For me, especially if you're doing remote backups, the best thing about HBS3 is the TCP BBR. It really makes remote connections work faster. So that backup job I showed you earlier where I was only getting 1.4 megabytes per second, if I don't have TCP BBR turned on that one, I only get 1.2 megabytes per second with that particular backup. So for me, it just lets the backup jobs to the remote site finish a lot faster. So that's why I like it. One of the extra features that we haven't talked about yet is that we do have a feature within HBS3 called QDedupe. So anybody familiar with data deduplication and how powerful that can be? QDedupe does a deduplication of the data before the backup happens. So if you're sending a backup job, perhaps of one of your shared folders, perhaps there's a couple of folders within that share where they actually have the same data in it. You know, the users on the network, they might have all saved the same 20 Excel files, for example. With QDedupe, it's not going to send 10 versions of that same 20 Excel files across to the other location and use all that bandwidth to do so. It's going to effectively send one copy and just link to that copy from the other one. So the actual data that gets sent is a lot smaller. So when you create a backup job, you get a nice little wizard here so you can choose where the data is going. So if I say I'm going to send it to a remote NAS, I'll choose my backup NAS. Click select, you can pick a paired folder. So if I say do my download folder on this NAS, and on the backup NAS, if I pick a different folder like the public folder, and click next, you can set your schedule. So you can do a real-time sync schedule. You can do it just once where it's a linked job. So for example, if you don't want the backup job to happen until one backup job is finished, you can link the jobs so that, for example, if I have my wedding backup going, I can say I only want this backup to run once after the backup for the wedding photos is finished. So now if we click next, you get all these different options for whether you want to apply filters. If you tick the apply filters box, it gives you an option to go in and filter your data so that you're not backing up really large files, specific files, files with a certain type of extension. You can be quite specific here if you want to. And then you've got your policies here where you can select lots and lots of different options. So TCP BBR is set by default. But you can go through here, remove additional files in the destination folder. So that would be a bit like a real-time true replication. Be careful of ticking this top box though. If you accidentally deleted a file on your first NAS, it would definitely delete it from the second NAS. So this feature is really good if you're looking for a disaster recovery target where it's exactly the same as the primary NAS. So even if somebody went into the first NAS and did a bit of tidying up, maybe there's a lot of old files, stuff that you've archived off that you no longer want on that NAS. This feature would allow you to tidy it up on one NAS, and then when the backup job next runs, it will also tidy up the second NAS and get rid of all those extra files if you wanted it to. So there's a lot of different options in here, and then you've got different rules for the event jobs and things like that. But yes, if you enable the QDedupe backup, it's really, really useful, especially if you've got a lot of duplicate data. You know, it could turn a 10 gig backup job into something that might be as small as an 8 gig. Depends on how much duplicated data that you have. But yes, it takes a little longer for the job to start because it's analyzing the files, checking what's different, what's the same, and then it runs the backup job. But even with that extra time it takes to analyze the data to find those duplications, the backup job usually will still end before it would have anyway because it's backing up a lot less data to the remote NAS. Okay. So somebody else is asking a question here, Mike. Would you use a sync job if you were backing up one QNAP to another? I probably would use sync simply for the logging, but when I'm doing a sync job of backing up one QNAP to another, it depends if you're doing it as a one-off because you bought a new NAS. If you're doing it as a one-off, you simply don't set a schedule. You just manually run the job when you're ready. But yes, for me personally, I use the sync. So if we go and look in the jobs that I've got running, my jobs, so I've got my backup NAS. So my main 4 jobs here are these main 3 jobs is the public, the multimedia virtual, and the backup wedding feature here. So all of these are actually synced. So I prefer the sync simply because you get a lot more data both during the backup as it's happening, so it gives you lots of extra information, rather than with rsync. Rsync is a bit more basic. It just says that the job is running and then it's finished. You get a bit more information with sync, so it tells you like how many files are being backed up, how many files it has backed up, an estimated time to end, the current speed of the backup job. You just get a lot more information within sync. So I generally always use the sync option personally, but there's nothing wrong with using rsync. It will work. It's absolutely no problem. You can use that as well. Okay. So Mike's just saying, here's a lot of folders, approximately 25. Doing this would be harder. Granted, you would have to do a few more folder pairs. The initial setup would be a bit more of a work to set it up, but for me, I would still rather do sync. But as I say, if you're using rsync, no problem. If you want to use the backup function, absolutely use it. It does work fine, and so long as you don't get any errors. For example, if it is to a remote location and there was an issue with the connection, for example, it's hard for you to diagnose what went wrong with rsync, whereas you get a nice detailed log file with the sync option. So that's why I like it. It helps with problem solving that happens down the line. So I've got a question from Arnold here. Can I sync from HBS3 to backup station on an older NAS model? Yes, you can. No problem whatsoever. There is compatibility between them. rsync will generally work. It is backwards compatible. Some of the features may not be available. For example, if you choose to do encrypted and compressed backups, the other backup station may not be compatible with those options. So that's a feature that you might want to make sure you've got upgraded on both units if your unit is able to have HBS3. Okay. Let's have a look at some other questions. So I see one from John here. Using a backup station NAS to NAS on remote replication, about 20 jobs for 3 different NASs, some run and request, all NASs on one LAN. So yeah, that would work fine. I see no problem with that. Well, it sounds like it's working fine for you, but yes, you can use that NAS to NAS backup. For me personally, if they're all on the same site and you don't have a lot of duplicated files, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. If backup station is working for you, stay with it. If you want something that gives you a little more information, a bit more logging, Hybrid Backup Sync 3 is really cool for that. It's really got a lot more information on it there as well. I've got a question from Krista here that says, if he wants to synchronize just a few files to my mobile phone, what should I use? For that, Krista, I would probably use something like QSync, which is an application that we have on the NAS. So here, if I click onto the left-hand menu, it's pre-installed on every QNAP. You've got QSync Central. It works a little bit like Dropbox. So Dropbox obviously works with a cloud provider, so you pay a subscription for it. But with QSync, QSync is using your NAS as the destination, so it allows you to designate certain folders on your machine. And if you've got our QFile app on your Android or iOS device, it will allow you to sync files to that. So that's QSync. We haven't really done QSync in this series of webinars. Maybe that'll be a webinar that we'll do after this, so we'll make a note of that one. Okay, I think that's everything from questions. Let me have a quick look. Another question from Arnold. Can I use QSync Central with QSync Central on another NAS? No, you can't. So QSync is dedicated to the one NAS. It's not for a NAS to NAS function. It's between the NAS and the users. Okay, so we'll move on to the next section here. So that's HBS3. So if you've got any other questions, fire them through. My colleagues will be able to answer them, or I can get to them after the session, no problem. So the next thing that I want to go through is our QVPN service. So within our QVPN option, this is a tool that will allow you to have remote access to, say, your network, to your QNAP from a remote location. So there are many ways to access your QNAP remotely. I guess the simplest of which is to open up some ports on your firewall through to the management ports of the QNAP. So you can find those management ports on the first setting in the control panel. So here you've got your 8080, which is your standard port, and you've also got your secure port down here. I do have a standard port there of 8080 typed in, but I'm forcing a secure connection only. So actually port 8080 doesn't work for my QNAP. I have basically got it disabled because I'm only allowing secure connections to my QNAP on the secure port of 443. But you can change these ports. You know, some companies may already have port 443 in use. For example, if you have an Exchange mail server with the webmail function, quite often that's what's using port 443 remotely for the office for your staff to remotely access your email. So you could change this to port 50, port 500. You can change it to anything that you want in that box, something that's not used, and you can port forward through to it. So another option that we have on all QNAPs is we do have our My QNAP Cloud feature. So My QNAP Cloud is an option that will allow you to create a dynamic DNS host for your QNAP. And it will also, if your router supports UPnP, it will also automatically open the ports on your firewall. I have UPnP turned off on my firewall, so there's a big red X there, so it's not going to work with mine. So I don't use UPnP for mine, but I've got everything forwarded through manually. And with my dynamic DNS, I've got a dynamic DNS host, and it updates it every few minutes to make sure that the host is pointing to the correct IP address for the QNAP. So this is one way to access your QNAP remotely. So you can use these features, and we also have a My QNAP Cloud link, which allows you to access your QNAP with no ports open on the firewall at all. But everything has to go through a third-party server effectively. So everything's going through one of our QNAP Cloud Link servers, so that you're doing an outbound connection from your remote location to our Cloud Link server, and so is your NAS, and we're the go-between for the two. This feature is really useful, especially if you're in something like a service office infrastructure where you don't have control over the firewall, where you're not allowed to open ports for security reasons. So this is a great option that instead of us just saying, no, you cannot have access to your QNAP when remote, this is a function that allows you access into your QNAP to access the data and services that it's running using My QNAP Cloud Link. The service I prefer to use is QVPN. So with QVPN, I do have to have some ports open to my QNAP through the firewall. So the service I prefer to use is OpenVPN, but we have lots of different options here. With OpenVPN, it gives you the server port. So on my firewall, I do have UDP port 1194 forwarded to the LAN IP address of my QNAP. So what I do is I connect to my QNAP hostname, which is this home.tatos.co.uk, or I could also do tatos.myqnapcloud.com, which is my dynamic DNS host. I could connect to either of those two, and it's going to allow me to remotely access my QNAP and its services. So you can set up the different options within here, the number of maximum users, the level of encryption you want to use, so you can set it even higher than what I've got it on. It generally makes the connection slower the higher you set it, so I've only got it set to medium. You can choose which network interfaces it accesses, and we've got 4 different services for you to pick from here. So we've got QBelt, which is QNAP's own service, which is really useful because we have applications to connect to this VPN from both iOS and Android. For your mobile devices, and you've also got the Mac and Windows options there as well. We've also got a PPTP option here as well. So PPTP is a bit old-fashioned, but if you don't want to install any extra software on your machine, PPTP will allow you to do it. It's just not that secure, but it does allow you to do a point-to-point tunnel directly to your QNAP from a remote location. We've got L2TP IPsec, so it gives you different options here, so you can have different passwords, different options that you've got there. You've got a DNS quick wizard as well, so if you want to set a different DNS server than the QNAP's running, you can also set that there as well. But yes, very easy to do, and you can have up to 20 clients on each of these services. So there's a lot of scope for having different users connect all the different ones. I use OpenVPN, and you download a configuration file effectively. You download this file, you install it onto the device that's doing all the configuration comes with it, including the host name, the usernames, the passwords, everything comes with that configuration file to access it. Within the privilege settings, you can see all the different users that you may have. So I've only got the one user, which is me on this QNAP, but you can add different VPN users. So I've got my colleague Tom there. If I wanted Tom to be able to access OpenVPN, I could tick him there and click apply. So now Tom's allowed to access our OpenVPN option that we have. But you can go through and disable them if you need to and change them around. Another option that we've got here is the online NAS users. So here in the online NAS users, it will show you who is actually currently connected. So this looks a lot better when something's actually happening there. So I'll just get my my phone to connect up to my OpenVPN profile here, just so that this shows some information. So here within the online NAS users, you see when somebody logged in, how long they've been connected for, which user logged in, how much data they're transferring. So you can see there that my phone has now connected. So it's giving you all the information of what's happening on that one. And you can manually force a disconnect for that user as well, if you want to. So from this picture, you get everything for all services. So if you had 20 people connected with the L2TP IPsec or 20 people connected with OpenVPN, it would show you. Now, the best thing about doing a VPN, apart from it being more secure, is that with the VPN, it's all encompassing. It's not just access to one service. For example, if I wanted to have remote access to our surveillance software, our virtualization software, for example, I can forward a specific port for that specific service through to my QNAP, and then I will be able to access that item. But I have to remember to forward all the ports. So it's not just the QNAP's main ports, it's the ports for its sub-services as well. So you're opening up quite a lot of ports through to the QNAP from the internet, from the unsecured side of the internet, all being passed to the QNAP. So that can be risky for some people. They don't want to open that many ports. It's maybe against their company IT policy. With VPN, you can open a single port into the QNAP, and once they've authenticated, they now have full access to every single port within the network for that QNAP. So it's really great for doing testing of things. If you want to test a service on a QNAP and you're remote, it allows you to do that with every service. You don't go, oh, I forgot to open that port and it's not going to work. Everything just works flawlessly if you do it with a VPN. It takes the guesswork away. So down here we got the connection logs, see who connected, when they connected, what service they used. So you get a nice big history there, so you can go back and see what's happening on it. And we also have a VPN client feature. Now a VPN client is a great option on a QNAP, especially if you've got two QNAPs where they're backing up to each other. You can have one QNAP VPN to another QNAP, so you can create a secure tunnel for the backup job to go across, even if they're not at the same site. So even without turning encryption on the backup job itself, this will give you the encryption on the communication between the two QNAPs. So it's really useful to do this. So you can add a VPN connection profile. You can pick which service you're running. Obviously, on the other QNAP, you have to make sure you enable the correct server type that you're going to use. But it allows you to do connections between two separate QNAPs. And at the bottom, you've just got the logs of anything that happened, you know, in the configuration changes or anything on the QNAP as well. So that's QVPN. Very easy to use, very easy to set up, and completely free as well. Okay. So now we'll move on to the last part of the backup, which the webinar, sorry, which I find the most interesting, which is our QCenter tool. So one thing I will say here is QCenter is completely free. We don't charge for any component within QCenter. It does work if you've got a single NAS, but it's better if you've got multiple NAS. The best thing about QCenter is it keeps a historic log of the data within your QNAP. So anything that your QNAP's doing, so instead of the storage of the data. So if it's how much CPU you're using on your QNAP, the throughput rates, the user connections, how is your storage doing? So are your hard drives healthy? Things like that. You get a single pane to see the status of multiple QNAPs. So I've got 5 separate QNAPs here. So a few of them are at my location. Some of them are not at my location. One's a virtual instance of our QTS operating system. So from this single pane here, I can see everything's good. I can see how much total capacity I have between these 5 separate NAS. So it's looking here, I've got nearly 40 terabytes with just over half used. So it gives you a status of how many warnings happened in the previous hour, how many disks are contributing to this whole setup. So I've got 25 disks between these 5 separate NAS. So this is just showing you uptime, just some basic information. If you want more detail about a specific server, you can click into the server option. Now within the servers, you get some more information, you get some useful tools. So I can see here that the top option here, which is a NAS that's not at my location, you can see the IP address is completely different from the rest of mine. This one is telling me that there's a download available and it wants a firmware update. So you can tell by the version, it's a little out of date. So from this location, if I wanted to, I could actually force a firmware update to happen on that QNAP. So I can tick that QNAP, I can go to action, and I can go update firmware. So even without logging into that NAS separately, I can actually send that firmware update command to that NAS without logging into it. I can shut it down, restart it. There's a lot of tasks that you can do within the QNAP. You can also click to a different QNAP. So if I click to this QNAP at the bottom, if you go to App Manager, if there's any apps to update, so I can see that Multimedia Console wants to be updated on that NAS. Without even logging into it, I can click tick on it, and click update, and it's going to confirm that the apps are going to be updated to the latest version. So that NAS is now doing that app update in the background. I don't have to go log into that one manually. I can make it all happen from the single screen. You can also tick all of them and do the same thing for all of them. So you could update the app on all of the separate NAS at once with one click. You don't have to log into each of them separately. So you can select lots of different options that are there. And you get a little status up here. So the background task that's happening right now is the webinar NAS is doing a download of the multimedia console application, and then it'll go off and install it. So it's really useful to get a lot of information about the different QNAPs. Now, if you want to deep dive into a lot more information about a specific QNAP, you can click on that QNAP. So if I click on the webinar one, this is the same NAS we were using in the last webinar. So this one here is going to show me all the information about the different adapters, the health information, are there any graphics cards inserted? So it's going to give you a lot of information in this overview. You can click into the storage section as well. So all of this is just a high-level overview of everything, but there's a plus symbol next to each category. So if you want some more information, so if I was to click on disk configuration and click the plus button, it's going to give me a lot of information about specific drives, capacities, temperatures, manufacturer of the drives, what type of bus they're connected to. And you can click on the smart information over here as well if you want to, and it'll download a little log file so that you can review that information locally on your own machine. So you can go minimize that, have a look at the cache acceleration configuration so you can see how that's configured. Is it being used efficiently? What's being accelerated by it? So it's very, very good for getting a lot of information. And then you get a lot of different tables. So if I click to a separate NAS that's been powered up for longer than a few minutes. So if I go to the main NAS here that I've been running the demo on here and go across to performance, you can see something a lot more detailed for the different sections. So you get things like the IOPS of your NAS. So what sort of demands is it under? If your IOPS are looking like they're getting a bit high, perhaps you need to add an SSD cache, perhaps you need to add some more options into it for adding the performance. Maybe you need more RAM if you see that the memory there was getting up to 100% usage quite often. So it's just really good that over time you get to see what's happening. So if you wanted to click within this memory usage to get more information, so if I look at the top here, this is just a range of 1 day. Perhaps I want to go back to over the last year. So I can see over the last year that my memory usage got quite high back there at the start of the year. Oh, right on New Year's Eve, it would seem. So on New Year's Eve, I was obviously doing something where it used a lot of different memory. So you can go through and see a lot of information that you want to about different QNAP options, different features, and you can also install apps. So if an app isn't installed on a QNAP, so you can go here and install it, and you get to see the same view of the App Center that you would have clicking the App Center on that specific QNAP as well. So if I was to go down here to our surveillance software and want to install one of our extra features, proof for spending some money. Perhaps you need some more drives or something like that. So you can go, I want to see my storage pool growth report. I normally prefer to switch it to a different type of chart. So here we're going to see a different storage pool report. You can pick which specific NAS you want to look at. You can choose the history of that specific NAS over 1 day, over 1 month, so you can see what's happening on the different NAS. So it's a really great place to say, take some screenshots to put into a PowerPoint presentation if you need to give it to your boss to get something done on a bit of spending that they might need. Okay. So this is everything that you would have within QCenter. There is also a firmware library feature that you've got as well. Within the firmware library, it allows you to download the firmware once at one site for that firmware file. You can even upload a file specifically. So if there's one that's not on our auto update structure, but perhaps this file is available from technical support for a specific feature that you wanted or a specific test that's being done, you can upload a firmware file into here and then push it out from your main QCenter to all the different NAS. Our firmware files are usually between 100, 150 megabytes. If you had 100 NAS, that's a lot of downloading for them to all go pull it from the internet themselves. If you uploaded it into here, you can pull from this firmware library to send out across the LAN to all your other QNAPs that you may have as well. But you can also do a quick check for update here, which would be the same as the check for update on the main QNAP. And you've also got the notification center, so you can set different alert policies. So this saves you having to do notification alerts set up on each individual QNAP that you have. You could do all of this directly from QCenter and have all of your QNAPs added into QCenter, so you've got one central place where notifications are happening. Perhaps you have different guys for different days for different monitoring. So if you wanted to set somebody's email address up on a Monday as the guy that's responsible for making sure the infrastructure is okay on a Monday, you could change that on the Monday. You could log in here and change it for whoever's looking after it on the Tuesday. Everything's done in one place. You don't have to go and change that setting for 50 different NAS. You can do it all in one location, and every NAS that's managed by QCenter would be done directly from within here. Okay, so you would basically think of this as a syslog server tool, but instead of being completely passive and just storing the log data, it also allows you to take some actions. You can make changes to the NAS. You can go in and add storage, change apps. You know, there's quite a lot of different things that you can do within the NAS. So within the different actions, you know, you can create a shared folder on the NAS if you wanted to. You know, it's not just basic things and apps. You can change fundamental things with the storage, even enable tiering on specific volumes as well. Okay, so that's everything that I wanted to cover off in this session today. So please make sure that you've signed up for the next webinar that's going to be happening in a couple of weeks. That's going to be about our surveillance software and the resilience tool that goes with it, the QVR guard, which monitors it for high availability within the surveillance software. And we'll be talking about our virtualization station and container station applications, all in the same webinar. So that's going to be a nice deep dive into how you can use those applications for different tasks that you have. So it's really good to have the understanding. And if you've got a QNAP that has at least an Intel CPU, a dual core Celeron or higher with 4 GB of RAM, you'll be able to play with any of the features we talk about in that webinar after it as well. So if there's something that you want to see on that one, that's all going to be available in that one as well. So we're going to leave the session open for a little bit, just so that we can go through any questions that are coming in. So if anybody does have any questions, feel free to ask them. If it's a question that's interesting for everybody, if you don't mind, I'll read it out so that everybody can get the answer, or I can just type the replies to you. Okay, thanks a lot for coming, guys. See you in the next one. I do see a question here from Mike saying, on both of my QNAPs, I cannot log into the QCenter application. Is there a default password, or is it because QCenter is installed on both? So if you've got QCenter installed on both QNAPs, they won't be managed by one QNAP. So what you would do is you install QCenter on a single QNAP, and then you add the next NAS into it from the first one. So I'll show you that in a second. But the password is the default admin password. So the login is admin and the password is the admin password for your NAS. There is no separate password for QCenter. It is all done directly within the main one. But if you were to click the add button here, so you would install QCenter on the first NAS. And when you first install it, even though this is installed on this main NAS that we're looking at here, by default, that NAS is not added into QCenter. This is actually blank. So what you have to do is you have to go to server, you have to go to add, and the first option you would do is add the local NAS. So that's going to add itself to its own QCenter. Once you've added itself, you can then go add single or multiple QNAPs under a certain subnet. So my NAS has multiple LAN ports, but if I was to click down to the bottom one and click next, if I had any QNAPs that were not yet added, they would come up in this list. I've already added them all, so this list will probably come up blank. But this will come up with a list, and you simply tick the QNAP that you want to add, type its admin password in, and then it will remotely install something called the QCenter agent. So the QCenter agent is the little thing that's going to be running on that remote QNAP to report all the data back to the head QNAP, the one that's in charge of everything. But they don't have to be within the same subnet. You know, you've got a lot of different options there. You can even add NAS behind a NAT router. But yes, there's a lot of different options to add your QNAPs depending on where they're currently located. A question from John. If a hard drive fails with a hot spare, what is the correct action that should be taken? So if you've got a hot spare, straight away without any interaction from you, the hot spare drive is going to jump straight in and do the rebuild. I'm just wondering if I can quickly demo that for you. So let's have a look here. I think I have a hotspare set up on this webinar NAS over here. So let's go here. Okay, so if I go look at the storage and snapshots for this specific NAS. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so if I just go check that I do actually have a hotspare before I do this, otherwise it's not going to show anything. Okay, so let's see here. Yep, so I've got a hotspare set up here in my hard drive pool on this specific NAS. So if I was to go and pull out a disk, so I'm not going to pull out disk 5 because that's the spare, but if I go and pull out disk 1, for example, on this QNAP, it's going to fail. So right now I've just pulled out disk 1 on this NAS. You might hear some beeping in a minute. The NAS is right beside my head. So this, I haven't told it I was about to do that. I haven't let it know that was about to happen. So that's now going to effectively cause a failed drive, and it's going to start rebuilding. So without any interaction from me there, John, you can see that it's now rebuilding, and it's put a rebuilding logo next to the spare one. It'll take a couple of seconds for it to absolutely realize that disk 1 is gone and make that go away. Maybe if I click refresh, it will happen quicker. So that's now doing a rebuild with that disk. So once you've been informed that disk 1 is the one that's failed, your action would be to replace disk 1. So once you've replaced disk 1, it's now going to become the spare. It doesn't chuck back the spare to be disk 5 and rebuild back to 1. It's going to be now a RAID array with disk 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 1 will become the spare when you replace it. But no interaction from you is required to get it back up and working. So somebody's asked here, for QCenter, what port or ports are required to monitor the QNAP at remote locations when no VPN is available? It's your standard NAS management port. So it would be port 8080 or port 443. This information is given to those remote QNAPs. So when you go into QCenter and you click add and you add a remote NAS, when it goes off and installs that QCenter agent, it gives it information about where to talk home to. And it's going to pull that information from within the main NAS screen. So it's going to pull information for your dynamic DNS. There's the beeping because I pulled that drive out. So it's going to pull that information from these two sections here. So it's going to give it the correct port number that it wants to talk to. The preference will always be to try and talk on 443, a secure port. So that's the port I generally will always open on my QNAP. But I do have port 443 and I have the VPN port forwarded through my firewall. Those are the only two ports that I have open to my QNAP. So if we go back to the webinar QNAP here, so it's now got lots of error notifications. Host 1 is disconnected, the RAID is rebuilded. So hopefully that answers your question there, John. But it's just going to do everything automatically to get back to a fully redundant state as quick as it possibly can. You can set hot spares to be specific to a volume, to one specific RAID group, or you can set global hot spares as well. So if you've got lots of RAID groups within your QNAP, you can have one hot spare drive for the whole chassis. If there's one very important RAID that you've got, perhaps you can dedicate a hot spare just to that specific volume, that even if a drive fails in another volume, another RAID, it will not take the hot spare away from that main volume that you've set it to. I have a question here from Kurt saying, do you have any ransomware protection? So we do have a couple of guides on the website that tell you what to set up and get working for that. But traditionally, what we're recommending that people do is install some specific service on your QNAP. So we've got malware protection, for example, that we would recommend. So we have a security counselor that you can install on your QNAP, and it will make recommendations. So it'll give you a report. So at medium risk. So it's complaining that I've got an application installed that's not in the App Center, so that's why I've got a medium risk option here. But I know what that app is. I installed it. I know what it is. But in this, it's going to tell you what you've got. Antivirus, do you have the malware remover installed and enabled? So everything here that I've got is free. You can use, I am using the free antivirus, but you can install instead of McAfee antivirus if you want to. But our malware remover application is a completely separate application that you open up, and it's going to give you a scan every few hours. It's going to, so I've got mine set at 3 a.m. every day, and you can go through the logs and you can see what happened when it did the scan. Is there anything of note within that log that it cleared up or that there was an error found? But those are the tools that we would recommend that you install to get it up and running. But yes, we do have a couple of security applications there, and we do have all the security advisories. So if there is any new advisories, this is going to alert you to them. And perhaps there's a new security risk. Make sure you update your firmware today. Make sure you install this fix today. So we're going to protect you as best we can. And you can subscribe to an email alert on those lists rather than just when you log into the NAS screen as well. Yeah, I think we're going to end it there. All right, thanks a lot for coming. Hopefully see you all in 2 weeks for the next session. If I didn't get to a question, I do apologize. I will download the report after the session and email you directly with some answers if possible. If anybody has any other questions for after the session, please feel free to send them to our email, which is UKSales, so UKSALES @QNAP.com, and that will go to myself and my colleagues, and we'll be able to get back to you if you have any questions between now and the next session. Okay, thanks a lot, guys. Cheers. Bye.